Hey everybody, Melon here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing a full in-depth review of the VAXEE NP-01s. Now I did cover a couple things about the VAXEE NP-01s in terms of the unboxing and what's included in the cable and that kind of stuff in my unboxing video. If you missed that, you can go ahead and watch that, but today is going to be a much more in-depth review of the mouse itself, its features, and the build quality and all that kind of stuff as well. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Now, just before we get started, big thank you again to VAXEE for sending out the NP-01s review. I greatly appreciate it. If you want to learn more about the product after you watch the review, I will have the product link down in the description for you. Alright, so let's start off with the shell shape of the NP-01s. Now this is, in my opinion, the most interesting and most unique part of this mouse, and I wanted to dedicate a good portion of the video to talking about it because this shape is very unique, but it's almost too unique to the point where it brings it into kind of a niche shape. By that I mean that this mouse is going to be meant for a specific subset of people who have a very, very specific grip style that doesn't meet the traditional ergo or symmetrical grip styles. Now the best way I can describe the shape of the NP-01s is that it is a right-handed non-symmetrical ergo hybrid mouse that is non-tilted. That has a slightly rearly positioned hump in the top of the shell. Now when I say that the NP-01s is a hybrid shape of a symmetrical mouse and an ergo mouse, that does definitely raise some questions in a lot of people's heads. So the best way I can describe it is that the front of the NP-01s feels like a traditional symmetrical mouse, like a GPX, Razer Viper, or whatever symmetrical mouse you want to compare it to, whereas the back of the mouse feels like an ergo hump that you'd find on a Razer DeathAdder V3 or a VAXEE Outset AX. Speaking of the Outset AX, it is actually the closest shape to the NP-01s that I have for reference. The shells are almost identical. The only difference is that the right side of the mouse on the NP-01s dips into the shell a lot more than it does on the VAXEE Outset AX, but this flare out at the rear of the shell on the left side of the NP-01s matches with the rear flare on the left side of the VAXEE Outset AX almost 1-for-1. The shell on the NP-01s is also a lot shorter than the shell on the VAXEE Outset AX, and it is also non-tilted as opposed to the Outset AX, which is a true ergo design. Now, since the NP-01s shares so many characteristics of the VAXEE Outset AX, we're going to see a very similar styling in terms of grip compatibility. The NP-01s is definitely designed for claw grip. You can get away with palm grip depending on your hand size, but claw grip is going to be the primary grip style used for this mouse. Now, for my claw grip style, the left side of the mouse, the rear flare here, just at the peak of the flare, does provide a lot of support for my pinky and my ring finger when I'm claw gripping. The indented right side of this mouse also provides a very natural resting place for my thumb, so it does feel very comfortable in regards to that. Now, due to the ergonomic flare out towards the back of the NP-01s, you're going to make a bit of a different contact than you would with traditional symmetrical mice. So traditionally with symmetrical mice, you make a lot of middle palm contact, but on the NP-01s, this flare out towards the rear end of the left side of the mouse does provide a lot of contact at the thenar part of your palm, just above the radial border. That is where I find the most contact happens on this flare out towards the back. It's more towards the middle of the thenar, but it will depend on your hand size. Whereas the right side of the NP-01s provides a lot of support for the hypothenar, which is going to be the opposite of the thenar below your thumb, just above the ulnar border. The slightly rear positioned hump on the NP-01s does also give you a little bit of support towards the lower proximal palmar area of your hand, but most of your anchoring is going to be in the thenar and the hypothenar on the opposite sides of your lower hand, just slightly above your radial and ulnar border. Now, this is based off of my 7.5 inch by 5 inch hands with my tilted claw grip. If you have smaller hands, you will most likely make a lot more contact with the proximal palmar of your hand, maybe even the distal palmar, depending on how high up you palm grip your mouse. But for the most part, the grip is primarily going to be in the thenar and hypothenar area of your hands for most hand sizes. Now, in terms of fingertip gripping the NP-01s, I would definitely not recommend this just because it does not have that traditional hourglass style we see on a lot of symmetrical mice, meaning it's going to be very awkward to fingertip grip. On top of that, the weight of the NP-01s definitely makes it pretty bad for fingertip gripping, so this is definitely not going to be a mouse you're going to be able to fingertip grip reliably in any way, shape, or form. You will primarily have to stick with palm and claw grips. Now, in terms of usage, as I mentioned before, this mouse is very comfortable for my 7.5 by 5 inch hands with my tilted claw grip. Again, I am traditionally used to ergo mice, so I definitely do like the ergonomic feel of the rear of the NP-01s, but the front of the mouse does feel very odd, and this niche hybrid shape is where this kind of starts to work against the NP-01s. Since it's not a pure ergonomic mouse or a pure symmetrical mouse, it's hard to actually utilize the mouse to its fullest extent. It's very difficult to describe the feeling of using this mouse. The best way I can describe it is that I never felt like I was fully utilizing the mouse due to the hybridity of the shape as I would on a pure form of a sim or an ergo mouse. Like, I never felt like I was going to be doing as well as I could on a pure symmetrical mouse like a VAXEE NP-10 or a VAXEE XE, or as well as I would do with a VAXEE Outset AX. I just never felt like I could reach the same operating potential, if that makes sense. Like I was always felt like with the MP1OS, I was operating at like an 80%. Whereas if I'm using a true ergo mouse like the VAXEE Outset AX, I feel like I'm operating at like a 95% plus kind of area. Now this analogy is going to sound kind of weird, but the MP1OS just kind of feels like the weird middle child of the VAXEE lineup, because they took the best parts of the MP10 and the Outset AX and just tried to make them work. And you just have this very strange hyper niche shape that just doesn't make a lot of sense. Another example of this would be if Razer took the front of the Razer Viper Mini SE edition and slapped on the back of the Death Adder V2 onto that mouse. It's just a weird shape that just doesn't really make sense. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are some people who will absolutely love the shape of the MP1OS. There's just something about it that just doesn't work for me, and I just can't put my finger on it. And like, I did have extremely good performance on the MP1OS. I broke several long-standing, very, very old Kovacs PBs with ease, but there was just always something about this mouse that just never felt right, and I just can never put my finger on what it is. It's just such a weird shape. And that's not to say that the MP1OS is a bad mouse. I do think this is a good mouse. I just don't think the shape works for a lot of people with traditional grip styles. Like if you give this to a person who's traditionally using a GPX, they're not going to like this shape. And if you give this to someone who's been using a Death Adder V3 for 5 years, they're not going to like this shape either. Again, it's really hard to put into words how this mouse feels in the hand. It always felt like I was operating at 80% capacity on this mouse, as opposed to like the 95 to 100 I feel like on other mice. It's just a very hyper niche shape that is very unique, and it is very different from everything else that's on the market right now. It's just a little too niche and just meets a specific niche subset of grip styles that aren't going to be very popular, opposed to regular symmetrical or ergo grip styles. All right, now let's talk coating. Now the coating on the MP1OS does feel very similar to the white coating on the Pulsar X2H, but it's a little glossier, where the X2H coating feels a little chalkier. The coating definitely pales in comparison to the coatings found on the Death Adder V3 wired and the black coating on the Pulsar X2 V2 and X2H. I initially thought I was going to need to install some kind of aftermarket grips like the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wing grips or the Soul Spacers on the MP1OS to help with gripability, but they actually held up surprisingly well during testing, and I didn't actually have to install the aftermarket grips, which was a nice surprise. There were some situations where I did feel like I needed to constantly readjust my grip on the MP1OS, but that's when my hands were very, very, very wet, but it was very infrequent. Overall, I will say I'm pretty impressed with the grip on the MP1OS. Now, it will be up to personal preference as to whether you want to install some kind of aftermarket grips on it. For the colored versions of the MP1OS, I would potentially recommend it. For the black version, you probably won't need it, just similarly to what we saw with the Pulsar mice, where the black coating and the white coatings are very different. That is the exact same situation here with the VAXEE mice. So the black version will always have the best coating. The colored versions are going to be slightly worse. But that said, the coating on the MP1OS Orange is still better than the vast majority of coatings I've tried this year. The only notable exceptions is, of course, the Death Adder V3 8K and the Pulsar X2 V2 black coating. So those are the only notable exceptions, but overall, it's actually performed surprisingly well. I'm actually quite happy with the coating. All right, let's talk about weight. Now, VAXEE mice have always come in on the heavier side, and that trend is continuing with our wireless versions of their mice. So the MP1OS at stock is weighing in the 68 to 69 gram range. Now, I did end up removing the stock skates and putting on my own, which I'll talk about that in a minute, but that did adjust the weight down to around 67.92 grams. Now, the weight balancing on the MP1OS is surprisingly good. Given the internal construction, I thought it was going to be a lot worse, but it actually is surprisingly well balanced, which is nice to see. Credit to VAXEE there. It will feel slightly back heavy depending on your grip style. For claw grip, it will feel fairly balanced. For palm grip, you may notice there's a little more weight towards the back of the mouse due to where everything's stored internally, but overall, it's actually surprisingly well balanced. Alright, let's talk QC. Now, VAXEE mice have long been criticized for their above average weight on a lot of their products, but you do get a bit of a trade-off for having the added weight. So while this mouse does come in at the 68 gram range, give or take a little bit, this mouse does have probably the best build quality I have seen on a mouse this entire year. It easily beats out the Pulsar mice in terms of QC and all the other mice I've used this year. It is just the best built and best QC'd mouse I have ever seen. It's built like a rock. There is no creaking, flexing, anything everywhere. This thing is just built extremely solid. Yes, that is at the cost of a couple extra grams, but in my opinion, that's worth it, because I would rather have a mouse with insanely good build quality that's a little heavier than a super light mouse with a bunch of QC problems. The final mouse. But while the overall build quality and QC of the MP1OS is absolutely fantastic, best I've seen this year, I cannot say the same thing about the skates. Alright, now the stock skates on the MP1OS are definitely the weirdest and most questionable part of this mouse in my experience. So by default, the MP1OS NP-01s is using a 0.6mm PTFE slightly rounded large surface area skates. You can also purchase 0.45mm skates of the same size and roundness if you want it from their website, but by default it comes with the 0.6mm ones. At first the stock skates did feel pretty good. They felt quite consistent for x-axis movements. They felt fairly consistent for y-axis, but there was a lot more friction going on the y-axis due to the large surface area on the stock skates. They felt fairly consistent for games like Counter-Strike and that kind of stuff where your primary aiming is going to be on the x-axis. However, in more dynamic games like Overwatch and Valorant in some cases, the added resistance for the y-axis definitely hampered the performance. Within the first week or so of testing, the skates felt very fast. They didn't have that much control. However, after they got worked in after around a week and a half of use, the stock skates became extremely slow. Now, keep in mind, I was only using the stocks on hybrid control fabric surfaces. I wasn't using them on any kind of high friction or glass surfaces. It was just normal wear on relatively soft fabric control and hybrid speed pads. Now, I'm not sure if I got a defective set of skates. I mean, skates are pretty hard to mess up, so I don't really think I got a defective version, but I don't really have a reason of why they would have worn down and slowed down in such a short period of time. The problem with the slowness that I wouldn't normally mind on a lighter mouse, however, it has a huge impact on a mouse with the weight of the VAXEE NP-01s at the 68 grams, because you already have a heavy mouse and then you have mouse skates with large surface areas that slow down very quickly, making this mouse extremely hard to use consistently. Now, I've said this before and I'm going to say it probably 1,000 more times. I hate seeing high surface area skates on any mouse above the 60 gram range, because once those skates wear down and they slow down, the entire mouse becomes essentially unusable. And this is exactly what happened with the NP-01s, because the weight of the mouse plus these very slow stock skates that have a high surface area just turned the mouse into an absolute mud fest, and it was very difficult for me to use. I actually developed some pretty bad strain injuries on my pinky and ring finger from trying to move the mouse around with these slower skates. And keep in mind, I play 40 centimeter per 360. I'm not up there in the 60-80 centimeter range, so I play relatively fast, and I was still having issues with how much these skates slow down. So I was left with the decision to either lower my centimeter per 360 down to compensate for the slowness of the skates or swap them out, and I ended up doing the latter. Now, to VAXEE's credit, they did include skate removal ramps on the design on the base of the NP-01s, which is a nice touch, so it was very easy to remove and replace the stock skate, which is a nice touch. I ended up replacing the stock skates with 6 of the X-ray pad obsidian dots, and the obsidian dots felt 100,000 times better. It helped offset the weight of the mouse with the lower surface area, increasing the overall speed, and it also balanced out the X and Y axis performance on the mouse itself, that's making the mouse as a whole feel way more balanced and way easier to use. Putting on the X-ray dots also resolved the strain issue I had on my pinky and ring finger as well. Now, I did have to raise the LOD on my NP-01s to compensate for the extra 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters added by the tallness of the obsidian dots, but aside from that, I didn't have to change anything else on the mouse. If you plan on trying any of the VAXEE mice, I would highly recommend you get some form of speed skate or dot skate to help offset the weight of the mouse and of course balance out the X and Y performance on the mouse itself, because the mouse feels 100,000 times better with the obsidian dots on the mouse itself, and the stock skates were just not it. I definitely think VAXEE should potentially look into selling some form of dot skate themselves. I would definitely use a different PTFE from what they're using right now, or increase the thickness of some variety, but whatever they could do to add a dot skate option for their mice would be a welcome change, because the stock skates in my experience on the NP-01s are very, very, very bad. Alright, let's talk about the main clicks on the VAXEE NP-01s. I'll just give you a little sound test here. The clicks themselves are slightly convex, but they feel pretty flat in the hand. They are using the same coating as the rest of the shell, which is nice to see. The previous VAXEE mice did have a different coating on the main clicks as they did as the rest of the body, so it's nice to see a uniform coating here on the NP-01s. Now, I did disassemble this unit, and I do believe these are 1.0 pink shell blue dot switches. However, they don't have the transparent blue shell we've seen on the same ones on the Keychron mice. These ones have a black shell on them, so I'm not sure if they're black shell pink dots or some other proprietary kind, or if they're just a blue shell dot with a black box on them. Regardless of whatever switch they are definitely 1.0 switches, and they do have a pink plunger, and they feel exactly the same as the 1.0 pink dot switches that are in my Keychron mice, so I'm going to assume it's the exact same one. The main clicks have very low actuation. They have little to no pre-travel. They do have a little bit of post-travel, I'd say around a medium amount there. The clicks have fantastic tensioning. They're very spammable, borderline maybe even a little too spammable. Now, I did have a similar issue on the original Pulsefire Haze 2. Those clicks were also very low actuation, and with my claw grip, sometimes when I move move the mouse to the left of my mouse pad, sometimes I would actuate the click by accident. I did have the exact same thing here. I will say it does go away once you get accustomed to the grip, but if you have bigger hands like myself, you will still probably accidentally cause the right click to actuate during gameplay when you're moving your mouse around. It's not the end of the world, and eventually you do kind of get used to it. One other really nice attention to detail on the NP-01OS is that the main clicks are indented just enough where the thumb won't prevent actuation of the main click, which is a really nice attention to detail. I cannot tell you how many mice I've used this year that do not have indented clicks and have problems with bigger thumbs holding down the actuation, specifically the Keychron mice. So I'm very happy to see that changed here. Really nice attention to detail from VAXEE. Now, one really weird thing I did notice about the NP-01OS's main clicks is that the anchoring for these is just kind of like a loose anchor. You can actually pull these right off of the anchoring towards the front of the mouse with like relatively low ease, which is mildly concerning given how the anchoring, I would expect it to be a little more structured, and I don't really know if I like the idea of this being able to just be pulled off very easily. Like if you put this in your pocket or into a bag and you catch like a piece of rope on the end of this click, you can just rip the click off very easily. So in terms of like a durability thing, this is going to be a mouse you're gonna have to keep in a protective case 100% so you don't damage the front clicks, because if you catch this on anything and it pulls and puts too much pressure on it, if you drop this mouse that lands on the front click, it is going to break this click almost immediately. So that is one downside I have in terms of the clicks. If it was a wired mouse, I wouldn't necessarily mind this so much, but since it's a wireless mouse, there's a much higher chance this is going to be falling out of a bag or onto a desk. It is definitely something worth noting. So that is definitely something I'd be very careful of. Just make sure you are very, very, very careful with the main clicks in this unit, because it is very easy to break them. Now, a quick note about the debouncing for the main clicks. You can adjust it on the fly with the rightmost button on the bottom. You can change it to 2, 3, 4, and 8 ms. All right, let's talk about these side buttons. I'll give you a quick little sound test here. The side buttons are semi-pill shaped, slightly convex side buttons. They are positioned about 3/4 the way of the upper side of the shell here. They are very well anchored. They have no wobble. The one problem I do have with them is that they're using a different plastic from the rest of the unit, which means it has no coating on it. But I'll talk more about that in a second. VAXEE is using 1.0 white dot switches for both the side buttons here. The front side button does feel slightly different than the back side button. As you can probably heard that in the audio, there's a back one is a lot louder than the front one, which is kind of odd. They do feel fairly similar to the main clicks, but they do have slightly more pre and post travel. They are still really well tensioned though, and they have a really great rebound with them. Now, the plastic differencing is the biggest problem I have with these side clicks, unfortunately. Since there is no coating on the side buttons like there is in the main click, you are entirely reliant on surface area to actually actuate these clicks. Now, this is great for dry hands, but this absolutely sucks for wet hands, because the buttons become very slippery and very hard to actually actuate due to their kind of pill-shaped design. Now, personally speaking, I don't really utilize the side buttons that frequently. I don't really tie them to in-game actions. I just kind of leave them alone. But for people who do rely on the side buttons for actions in-game, I can see the lack of coating on these ones being a huge issue. And of course, you can always apply aftermarket grips onto the side buttons to fix the gripability issues, but since weight isn't really that big of a problem on VAXEE mice, and VAXEE mice always have this really good durability and just overall really good feeling, these side buttons definitely stick out in a very negative way. Even the side buttons on my 4-year-old VAXEE Outside AX that are like literally almost worn to nothing feel better than the brand new clicks on my NP-01OS here. It would be nice to see VAXEE take these side buttons and swap them out for ones that have the same coating as the rest of the unit, just because it's going to feel a lot more cohesive and consistent, because the plastic that's on there right now stands out like a sore thumb in my opinion, and it just does not feel good compared to the rest of the unit. Alright, now one area where VAXEE has made a massive improvement is in the scroll wheel. I'm going to give you a sound test from the old VAXEE Outside AX, and I'm going to give you the sound test from the new scroll wheel so you can tell the difference. And this is the new scroll wheel on the NP-01OS. Now, keep in mind, I had to raise the volume on the NP-01OS scroll wheel by about 5 decibels. If I did that to the previous scroll wheel, the VAXEE Outside AX, they'd probably all be deaf right now. So there is a massive improvement in the scroll wheel overall, which is really nice to see, because that was one of the biggest gripes a lot of people have had with VAXEE mice in the past. Now, the encoder on the NP-01OS is the Alps encoder, and it is using a 1.0 white dot switch for the scroll wheel click, which is the same as the side buttons. The rubber texture on the scroll wheel is nice, has a good grip to it, is very consistent. The scroll is fairly light and smooth, but there are very pronounced scroll points whenever you scroll. The scroll wheel is almost completely silent, which is nice to see. The only real noise you get from the scroll wheel is from hitting the scroll points, which is a really big improvement. The wheel click is pretty much a 1-for-1 with the side buttons in terms of actuation force and overall feel, which is nice to see, but overall it is a massive improvement over the previous scroll wheel iterations on previous VAXEE mice. Now, the NP-01s and all the recent VAXEE wireless mice are using VAXEE's new wireless tech, which does have some changes to the actual sensor on the unit itself. So I want to talk about the sensor specs and then we'll talk about the wireless capabilities. So the NP-01s is using the PixArt-PAW 3395DM-T6QU, which is a modified 3395 with most of the features you'd expect. However, there have been some pretty heavy modifications to this sensor. The DPI is locked to a maximum of 3200, so you can only do 400, 800, 1600, and 3200. Now, I believe this is locked down for power efficiency, but I don't know for sure. The sensor does have a max DPI of 26,000 since it's a 3395, but it's locked down to 3200 on the VAXEE mice. The report rate is preset to 125, 500, and 1000 Hertz. Now, VAXEE is working on 4K polling rate. I believe it's going to be coming out sometime next year, but we'll have to wait and see what the implementation for that is going to look like. The sensor itself has 3 connectivity modes. There is also added anti-interference tech, and it is also using a different MCU that I have not seen any other mice use. It is using a PixArt-PAR 2862QC MCU. According to what I can find online, which isn't much, this appears to be some form of special MCU that works with the modified PixArt sensors for better use. I believe this PixArt MCU is used in collaboration with the main sensor to enable the 3 performance modes on the VAXEE mice, because that was custom made by VAXEE with PixArt, so I'm assuming it's all custom tech, but if it's something else, let me know down in the comments. I'm just assuming it's a specialized MCU for the special connectivity modes. Now, speaking of the connectivity modes, this is the big selling point of VAXEE's wireless tech. There is a reason VAXEE's wireless tech took so long to hit the market, because VAXEE wanted to make sure they did this pretty much perfectly, and for what I've seen so far, they have done so. So the 3 modes are the standard mode, which is the optimized performance with the best battery life of approximately 100 hours, give or take your use case. The next mode we have is competitive mode. Now, this is the big creme de la creme of VAXEE's wireless tech. I'll talk about this a little more in a minute, but basically what this is designed to do, it is designed to mirror the polling rate reporting and the overall feel of a mouse being used over a wired connection over wireless, which is crazy. It does use a lot more battery. It does knock down the battery life to around 55 hours, but it does have essentially 1-for-1 performance with wired. I'll go into a little more detail in just a second, but that's a TLDR of what it does. And the final mode we have is competitive mode plus motion sync, which just adds even more dense polling rate reporting to the competitive mode. Now, it doesn't really affect the battery life too much. It's pretty similar. I think it's only a difference of like a couple hours, but it's basically just competitive mode with motion sync enabled. Now, you change through these performance modes via button combinations on the bottom of the VAXEE mouse. Now, I'm not going to go over those in this video because there's a lot of combinations and I don't want this video to be 2 hours long. So if you want to find out how to do those, go ahead and find the user manual for your VAXEE mice. You can read all the information there. It is a little weird to get used to it, but once you get used to it, it does make sense. It's just a bit of a learning curve to get used to the button combinations. Now, in terms of testing these modes, to be completely honest with you, 99.9% of people are going to be completely fine with the standard mode because it still has really good performance and it has the best battery life out of all of them. Realistically speaking, I didn't notice a huge difference between the standard mode and the competitive mode with motion sync. The only thing I noticed difference was that battery loss. The differences between them are going to be so minimal. You would have to be like a professional with a 365 hertz monitor and like an LDAT to actually tell the difference. Going off of feel, they all felt the same. Personally speaking, even the one with motion sync enabled and with motion sync off, it all felt pretty much identical. But then again, I'm just going off of my aim feel, which is the only thing I trust right now because I don't have any other tools to test it. So I'm going off of just feel, so keep that in mind. But across standard mode, competitive mode, and competitive mode plus motion sync, they all felt fantastic. I have no problems with any of the modes. They just feel really consistent. They perform very well, no problems at all. Now, one quick note about compatibility that I noticed that was kind of odd. The NP-01s worked with every single mousepad I tested. I had no problems with any of them. SkyPad, Serapad, Kin included, they all work totally fine. The one mousepad the NP-01s does not work on is the IKEA Glass. I, for the life of me, cannot figure out why. I tested different LODs, different DPIs. It just does not track on that mousepad for whatever reason. I think it's due to the thickness, but I don't know for sure. So that's the one note. If you have the IKEA Glass, you cannot use the VAXEE NP-01s on it. All the other mice I have work totally fine. Just the NP-01s doesn't work on it for whatever reason, which I thought was kind of odd. All right, now in terms of onboard memory and software, as I mentioned before, the NP-01s is completely driverless. Changing performance modes, changing debounds, changing LOD, changing everything about the mouse is done on the mouse itself via different button combinations. Now, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of button combinations for the VAXEE mice, so I'm not going to cover them in this video. If you want to learn how to do the different button combinations, you can check your user manual for your respective VAXEE mice, and it'll tell you how to do them in there. Now, the only other thing I did want to note is that there is no actual driver software for the mouse itself, since it is driverless. However, there are firmware updates for the mice, so I did have to do 2 of them for the dongle and the mouse itself when I first got my NP-01s. So be sure to check the VAXEE website and download any firmware updates for your mouse before you use it, because you may be missing important fixes. Alrighty, now in terms of the repairability for the NP-01s, I do want to say something just before I get into this. So I did actually break my NP-01s. I am not aware of how I did it. As part of all of my reviews, I disassemble and reassemble all of my mice, and somehow during that process I managed to break my left click on my unit. There's no visible damage. There's no visible damage to the switch itself. The tensioning is all fine. I literally have no idea what I did. I can't figure it out for the life of me, but the main click does not work anymore. Now, this is not going to retroactively affect my overall review. A lot of my review is finalized before I took it apart, as I usually do, and the repairability was the last section I had to write for the review. So just because I broke my mouse is not going to have a negative opinion on the rest of the review. The whole review is pretty much finalized and nothing has been changed since then, so this isn't going to retroactively give a good or worse review of the NP-01s just because I broke it, so just to be clear. Now, in terms of serviceability, this is the hardest mouse to service I have seen this year. The build quality on the inside is great. There's a reason this mouse feels so good in the hand, but it is insanely difficult to repair. Under no circumstances should you attempt to do a repair on this mouse. There are ribbon cables that are everywhere that are very easy to damage. There are a lot of very small components that are very easy to break, and the main clicks themselves are incredibly sensitive to any kind of unscrewing or moving on them, and you do need to take the main clicks off to disassemble the unit. So as a whole, do not take this mouse apart because you will probably end up breaking it like I did. This is easily the most unserviceable mouse I have seen this year. This thing is impossible to take apart, so under no circumstances should you take this apart. If you have a problem with your mouse, you should send it back to VAXEE during the warranty period. Now, in terms of how you're going to fix stuff like a dead battery or a dead switch or some kind of internal component that's going to be outside of the 1-year manufacturer warranty, I'm going to talk about that in another video because I do have a lot of thoughts about this, specifically with my experience with VAXEE in terms of buying a replacement part. So that is going to be on a different video. I just didn't want to make this video too long. I mean, it's already pretty long, but I didn't want to make it like 40 minutes. So I will talk about that in a future video, so stay tuned for that. But in terms of repairability, this is going to be receiving the first F that has ever been given out on the channel. If for whatever reason you want to take it apart and you just have a death wish for this, I guess, I will be posting a full teardown of the NP-01s because there is no official guide on how to take this apart available from VAXEE. So I will be posting a full teardown of this mouse with instructions on how to take it apart safely over on the channel in a couple days, so stay tuned for that. Alrighty, now in terms of final thoughts, the NP-01s is a very weird mouse. It's not a bad mouse necessarily, I just don't think it's a mouse that fits a lot of grip styles. The shape is just too niche in my opinion to justify the price and justify its existence, to be completely honest with you. I will say the performance tech that's inside the NP-01s is fantastic. It's probably some of the best, if not the best, I've used this year. Just the shape just ruins it. I will say though, if this was a different shape, if this was a pure symmetrical or pure ergo mouse like an Outside AX or an NP-10 or an XE, I have a feeling my opinions on it would be a lot more soft, not as harsh. It's hard to justify this mouse because there are just better options available on the market in a better shape. That said though, if you are someone who does like the feel of a symmetrical ergo hybrid, then this mouse is going to be great for you and you're going to be part of that very small niche people who are going to be able to use this mouse to its full potential. But just with the issues I had with it in terms of the overall shell design, the skates, the slide button design, the repairability aspects I'm leaving out of this review because that's not really fair for them, but just the shape alone, the skates and the side buttons are just, and the overall feeling of I could never just use this mouse to its full potential, or I could never just kind of match my peak on this mouse, is enough for me to not really recommend it. So unfortunately, NP-01s is going to be a bit of a miss in my opinion. I will definitely do my best to try and cover the upcoming Outside AX wireless and the NP-10s wireless whenever it does release, because I would love to take a look at both of those mice, because again, a purer shape with this performance technology makes a lot more sense in my opinion, and I think I'd have a much better experience on those mice, but the NP-10s is just hard to justify. Anyways, so that is going to be everything for today. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you again to VAXEE for sending this out. As I said before, I will have a full in-depth teardown and repairability guide of this mouse coming out in a couple days, so stay tuned for that. But until then, I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace.